So, David Francis, thank you so much for joining me here on the Burning Castle podcast. For anyone who can't see David, he is in the most classic of all writers' garrets up in an attic. So I won't filibuster the beginning of this episode. I'll turn it over to you, David, just to give a little bit more background than the formal introduction that we just heard. Tell us just the basics, the fundamentals about who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm essentially a kid from the country in Australia, where I've just returned from the farm where I grew up, that my sister now runs, which is kind of a horse situation. And I grew up doing that, and I rode show jumping horses, which is an odd kind of sport for Australia internationally in the 70s and 80s. And then I'm a lawyer by trade. I've recently retired from a law firm called Norton Rose Fulbright, which is a big international firm where I did public finance, which is financing schools and hospitals and universities. I started writing in the maybe mid-90s, and my first novel came out in the early 2000s, and I have 3 novels in the world and a new one that I recently finished, and I am involved with PEN International, the Freedom of Expression organization, which defends writers throughout the world. And I'm on the board of PEN International, and have also been involved with PEN America here in the States. And I'm currently in LA, in Hollywood, looking out my attic window into the rain, into the Hollywood Hills, and delighted to be here with you, Ashley.
Thank you. So, I've got a few questions. A big one is how and why you got into writing as someone who's trained in law, who had what sounds like, by all measures, a very successful career in that field. And there's sort of this intersection of 2 questions that I have. But at the heart of it is the question of why. Why would anyone want to be a writer? It's a question that I ask myself every day. Struggling in this field that is so filled with struggle, and with some of the stories of the most successful by literary standards are those who struggled the hardest. And we've kind of lionized, we've made myths of Dostoevsky or whoever working his fingers to the bone in Siberia in order to carry out this noble craft of his. So why did you do it? Why do you do
it? Growing up in the boonies in Australia, I always secretly wanted to be a writer. I don't know why I didn't study journalism or creative writing. Not that that was really on the radar. I studied law because it was a way to make a living. I was never passionate about it. What I was passionate about was the sport I did. And so I accidentally became a lawyer and worked for a firm in Australia, and then got on a team to ride jumping horses in Europe, and then washed up here in the States. So I never loved being a lawyer, and I always used it as a vehicle to be able to afford to do other things. And the gift of that it's allowed me to afford to write what I like, what I want to write, what I'm passionate about, and not really be a gun for hire. So I have written strange, somewhat unusual fiction that I have loved doing. And so I fought for the time to write as a lawyer. And when I got that window where I was able to, I was usually in a place where my subconscious mind had been preparing me to put something on a page. And I'm grateful for that. It's only now, having retired from the law, that I'm doing some editing work where I'm working with other writers, and but still doing my own stuff. So I still have a passion about writing fiction, and I don't resent it. And it seems to me I kind of hate the word gift, but it's a gift for me to be able to do that and pursue that in whatever way it unfolds for me.
It's an interesting model, the one that you pursued. It's it's you're by no means a solitary figure who's kind of went down that path of a profession to pay the bills, to more than pay the bills, to establish a livelihood, a life, something that will carry you through and support the art. It's I think of Anthony Trollope. I'm reading right now, who was Postmaster General of England, within pre-United Kingdom, and wrote in the mornings and did it religiously and was prolific and, in my opinion, genius. Or more recently, Amor Towles, who was I believe an investment banker. It might have been private equity, but I think an investment banker who was sort of a bit of a wonderkind in fiction, left fiction to go into banking and finance, and then sort of returned to fiction more recently after a 30-year-long career. And it's a very interesting pathway, but I imagine, and I've been on that pathway myself, in some regard, I would say probably less successful than some others, including you, in both tracks, in both the fiction and the professional track. But it comes with a certain amount of hardship, I would imagine. I feel that it comes with a certain kind of tension, that you are doing this other thing in your life that you don't fully believe in and you don't fully trust. Is that something you experienced? And if it is, how did you deal with that tension if you felt it?
I think that pursuing a career that isn't a passion does take an emotional toll. And over, I did that for 3 decades. And what I was eventually able to do was create a gig where I had some flexibility. I came in originally taking a fair amount of time away to do a sport. And then I morphed that into taking a fair time away to travel doing writers' retreats. And I would take a month off and go to there's a place called Hawthornden Castle in Scotland where I got a fellowship. And I did 6 months in Paris at the Cité des Arts, where I got an Australian writing residency. So I was paid less than I was worth to the law firm, but they charged me out at a pretty high rate. So I was able to establish an equation that kind of gave me some flexibility. And so it wasn't quite as soul destroying as it otherwise might have been, but still it took its toll. I weirdly was able to switch, even in my office, from drafting documents and then going into the world of my fiction quite readily. And I don't know whether that's a function of some kind of ADHD or something, but I do remember my first novel, my boss, who was quite supportive, I would say, suggested should be called On Company Time, was her suggested title for my novel, because it was kind of known that I had this other life and that I was pursuing it, and that was my real passion. And without the writing, I don't think I could have ever done that. And I'd also add that I did this sport that was highly adrenalized, sounds like a very American word, but there was a lot of adrenaline involved and sort of expectation and disappointment and traveling. And I would jump on a plane and go to Palm Beach in Florida, and I was sponsored and would ride these horses and come back. And that world was, I didn't sleep, and there was a lot of danger involved. And then I got to a space where actually I was in therapy, and my therapist asked, what's your true passion if you wanted to be a little bit still, and that was writing. And so I got brave enough to do that, terrified that I wouldn't be good, but whether I'm good or not, that's what I need and want to do with my life.
So that first novel, it sounds like you're already into your law career at that point. And how did it happen? Where did the seed come from? How did you accept that this was the particular pathway? Because writing can take many forms. It could have been stories, it could have been poetry, it could have been any number of things, memoir. you chose a novel, which in my mind and in my experience, my personal experience, is the most difficult choice. I've done various kinds of writing. A novel sucks you dry and then some. So how did you get to that point, and how did you grapple with it? Was it a natural choice? Did you have to come to terms? What was it like? And how did you come to the idea for what this novel would be about and what it would be in the world?
I didn't consciously choose that genre. I just started writing, and it emanated originally from when I was maybe 19. I was at law school in Australia, and I worked with horses about 70 miles from my law school, and my grandmother had gone blind and lived in a facility. She was 98. And I would visit her every day between my horse farm job and law school and sit with her. And she had grown up in the outback of Australia in the 1880s. Her mother was from Salzburg in Austria, and her father was a feckless Scot and had, it's funny, I haven't told this story for such a long time, but he met her when she was singing as a young opera singer in Vienna, and
Wow.
swept her off her feet and took her to the outback of Australia, to a place that was 100 square miles in the middle of nowhere. And she had these kids in this mud brick house and the Aboriginal tribes warring at the bottom of the garden. So my grandmother would tell me these stories, and I wrote them down, and I thought one day I would like to write about this. And so it wasn't, for another 20 something years, or 20 years, that I started playing with that idea. And I got into a writing group with a writer called Les Plesko, who was a really great novelist and editor, underpublished, but had a following here. And I was told that if he likes your work, he'll invite you to his private workshop. And I think I probably would have written myself into oblivion if I hadn't found myself there. But I wrote in a kind of organic fashion, not knowing whether it was going to be stories or a novella or a short story or what it was going to be. But I was just writing this story in a very kind of almost unconscious way. It was sort of flowing through me from other generations of my family. It was kind of a bleed through. And that great grandmother, whose story it's a little bit based on, the sense was that she was Jewish and that she was had ended up in this very alien environment during the war. So I melded up some of my experience and some of her experience and my grandmother's experience in what became Agapanthus Tango. And then, just to add on to that, I sat with a woman at a dinner party who represented a number of writers and directors, and she's Audley Paul Verhoeven's, who just has a movie out called Benedetta that's about a lesbian nuns in the 1300s. Anyway, I became friendly with her, and I got brave enough eventually to tell her that I was writing something, and I sent it to her, and she sent it to an agent in London that she worked with. And a week later, there was a bidding war for it in London with between Picador and Fourth Estate HarperCollins, which was this amazing thing. I mean, it's sort of been all downhill since then, but that was sort of a miraculous confluence of events.
How old were you at that time? Just to place you in time.
I was probably 2000. I would have been early 40s, 2001. Yeah.
So that must have been, I mean, it's such an interesting thing to come into particularly fiction, because usually people start very young in fiction. When they succeed, they're on that path, they're on a track, like in most careers and professions. They go to the school, the MFA programs, and then they go to the journals and they get the agent and blah, blah, blah. So this was quite a different path. And I imagine that must have been a very validating experience to write the book, that came from somewhere, not somewhere, almost genetic, and then to have it picked up in such a fashion, it really must have been something nourishing.
It was, I mean, it was kind of extraordinary, but also it was weird because here I was with my life in the US, and this book was published in various languages, published in Australia and, you know, Holland and Italy and Germany and France and the UK and elsewhere. But in America, it wasn't picked up for another 5 years.
Mm.
And that was a strange experience. Yeah. Not to feel, I felt like I'm a writer, but I'm not a writer in America. So in my own
Yeah.
life, I didn't quite inhabit it. It seemed like something that was happening far away.
Mm-hmm.
And yet on the strength of that, I was able to, you know, I got this fellowship to Paris for 6 months, where the Australian Literature Fund sends an Australian writer to this garret in the Marais in Paris, which was amazing. And and I thought, I'm never going to have to go back to law after this. I can't stand it. And I just thought of how my novel got published in France was, I had a foreign rights agent in London who sent this book to an editor at Éditions du Seuil, which is a really good house in Paris. And she had asked him if I was writing something else. And that agent hadn't responded to her, but I had met someone in Paris who I'd given my card to that had the name of the novel on it and the cover of the novel on this card. He was a translator, and he happened to be on the train with this editor, this French editor, and he opened his wallet and she saw that card and she was like, oh my God, I love that book. I heard back from them. Nothing ever came of that. And then by the end of that day, I had a publishing deal in France, which was like one of those weird serendipitous things.
Yeah, you know, it's one of these things that it seems serendipitous. It seems lucky, but I feel like there's also an element of some karmic element of luck, where you're putting action into the world, you're putting energy into the world, you're at the dinner party, you're in Paris. You know, it wasn't blind luck. There was some intention behind it that was your doing, that somehow something in the world reciprocated it. So, you know, I feel like that's because I think to a lot of people hearing a story like that, it's like, well, why can't I just get lucky like that? But there's much more to it than that.
I think that's really true. I think being someone who's bold enough to go and, I mean, I think there's sort of chutzpah behind the luck. There's this sort of being out in the world and meeting people and being able to talk about what you're doing and making connections and allowing manifestation in a way with a kind of intention. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
Right. So you have the first novel out in the world, just not in your part of the world, which is actually something I hear and I've paid attention to, that a friend of mine who's actually French was asking me if I've read, I can't even remember the name of the author. And I said, I haven't heard of this guy. And he was absolutely gobsmacked that I'd never heard of this world famous, and he wasn't even a French author. I think he was a Italian Jewish author who is like the big guy in France that nobody in America has ever heard of. It's one of these weird things that just, you know, these weird angles of literature, that something works in France, it has no appeal in the US. What works in the US has no appeal some other place. It's just this strange kind of array of international taste. But for you, this was working, and that, how did that roll into the next book and the next book after that? How did you, was it just saying to yourself, okay, great, things are moving along, let's think about the next idea? Or was it, you know, was there more to it than that?
It's funny that you say the word idea. I feel as though, and this always sounds suspect, but I feel like I don't write from a conscious idea. I write I write a scene that I see
Mm-hmm.
and allow it sort of organically to inform and unfold into the next scene. And if I have this great idea and I'm trying to write from A to B, I feel like I'm engineering a story that may want to go to Q, you know? And if I can get out of the way of my conscious engineering, loyally structuring mind, something more original might emerge. And for my second novel, which I started, as I recall, during that gig in Paris, because I'd finished my first book then, I started writing a story of a kid, a young guy, a young Australian artist who was heading to Moscow on a train from Prague. And I had done that when I was um, maybe 23 or something, and it was still the Soviet era. And I'd taken photos out of the train window, knowing that you weren't supposed to take photos of telecommunications or infrastructure, but I was taking pictures of horse-drawn hay carts and women in the fields with scythes, and it felt very kind of Turgenev. Turgenev wrote a book called The Hunter's Album or The Hunter's Tales or something that was very sort of rural Russia in the 1800s. And it felt very much like that. Anyway, I essentially got arrested when I landed in Moscow because I'd taken these photos, and I was telling that story in a novel setting. And then I was also writing about a kid growing up in Australia, and I had these two, what I thought might have been two different novels. One, a sort of suspense, emotional love story that was happening in Soviet Moscow at the end of Andropov, early Chernenko, very repressive time. And this other Australian story, and they eventually married into what became Stray Dog Winter, which was my second novel.
It's a really interesting point to think about over-engineering a novel, you know, because there's, I think along the spectrum of how someone could write a novel, on the one hand, you have something that's very free and free-flowing structurally, and then on the extreme opposite end, you have something that's much closer to a crime novel, crime fiction, or a thriller that's very engineered. And, you know, I feel like people try to put themselves somewhere along that spectrum, or generally they go one side or the other. And I know that's something that I've grappled with, how to place myself, and probably thinking too much about it, because, you know, you start to think about the audience, because you start to think about, how is this ever going to sell? Because you're thinking about, how am I ever going to make a living doing this? And that comes back to what you were talking about, having a career which kind of, you know, has its own burdens, but frees you from that other thing, where you don't need to calculate, how is this book going to earn me a living so I can live a decent lifestyle? Is it something you feel like you gained from the path that you took?
Yes. I believe it's certainly given me the freedom. And it's not like, I mean, I've sold in various countries, but it takes me 5 years to write a novel the way I work. So I could have lived off that nicely for a year,
Right.
but amortized over 5 years, that's not a great living. But you
Yeah.
use the word thinking, and I think thinking is maybe not always an asset.
Mm.
Certainly for
Yeah.
me, when I get into my thinking mind, I get out of my unconscious mind. And if I write anything decent, it's usually in my half sleep longhand when I first wake up in the morning, when
Mm.
I'm in that sort of dreamscape world. And I try and write more from my body
Mm.
than from my mind, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I work with people and a bit writers and introduce them to their work um, through meditation to try and get into that sort of sensory detail, that what do they call it? The vivid continuous dream. Excuse the dings.
That's the meditation gong of the digital era. Um, so how does that work? How do you write from that that place? How do you get to that place, and how do you write from that place? Because as I had just mentioned, the writing that I have done for the novel that I wrote recently was very thought through, planned out, meticulous. And this is not, these are not ways of praising myself. I'm not really sure that that was the best way. So how do you do it, and how does it, and how do you know you're doing that in a way that makes sense?
I believe I try to inhabit my body and be in the present in a way that I'm not distracted by the world as much, and can begin to inhabit the story and dream around inside the story, and in my mind's eye see a room, see an expression, smell, get the details in a way that I'm not coming at it from the outside. I'm not imposing my intellectual mind on the story, but allowing it to emanate from a more organic place. And I learned that through that first novel that was sort of bubbling up through my DNA, you know? So it's a strange adventure, and it takes a lot of getting out of my head, and getting out of my head space that's trying to make sense of everything and control the narrative and trying to get it to where I think it's supposed to be. But just inhabiting a story and allowing it to unfold, and trusting that I might be writing into some box canyon that I'll need to throw stuff away, but something in that work will inform something else, and a sentence or a word. There's a book by a woman called Annie Dillard called The Writing Life, that talks a lot about this as a way of writing. But as you say, if you're writing with a deadline, or very specific goals or something imposed, it's a risky way to do it. And I'm friends with Jane Smiley here in California, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning American writer, and she would never leave the gate until she knew exactly where she was going. And now I was with a panel once with Colm Toybeen, the wonderful Irish writer who lives in New York, and Anne, whose last name escapes me, who just won the Booker Prize. And they were coming at this equation from two totally different perspectives, both wonderful writers. So I think it's a little bit how you're wired in the brain. And I think it's hard to become one if you're the other, but I think you can meld those worlds somewhat. I also think that my loyally structured mind works in the background without me being so aware of it, to provide some underlying structure. And so I think sort of some poets and writers that I know who live totally in the sort of ethereal, wifty world, it's harder for them to stay on a track working in that fashion.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a bit inverted from what you would normally think. You would think normally that it's the conscious mind driving the process and the unconscious mind shaping it in the background. For you, it sounds it's a bit upside down, from the rest of us. It's your unconscious mind leading the way, and in the conscious intentional piece that's kind of in the background, shaping things, putting scaffolding around it as you go. Very interesting.
It's a matter of accessing that unconscious mind, and that's the tough but most interesting part to me.
Yeah, that's something that I loved so much about writers of the early 20th century, the surrealists, Henry Miller, in his big tomes and the Rosy Crucifixion. It's just this incredible. It's not even stream of conscious. It's stream of unconscious. It's deeper than that. And it takes you along, and you're somehow captured by it. It's the weirdest thing. It shouldn't really work, but it does. So what are you doing now? You've retired from your law profession, from your day job. Where does that leave you? I mean, working a job like that is very structured. It structures your time, especially with the law, because you're billing hours. And now your interaction with time, I'm assuming, is a bit different. and also with the writing because of that, because you don't have that narrow kind of window to work in, you've got more. So what does your day look like, and what does the writing look like on account of that?
My day is freer, I will admit that. I have taken on some editing jobs where I'm editing novels for writers, and that gives me some structure and something just to go to that feels like work. But I've been getting up in the morning and getting on a meditation with a bunch of poets, and then writing from a prompt, sort of freehand, and seeing where that takes us. And then we read whatever poems we've written. And that's a really interesting skill for me, to write in the moment with these accomplished poets where, that's not what I am. And we oddly just have a little collection that's come out just yesterday called Slow Lightning Impractical Poetry, that has grown out of that group, which is a
amazing
little project. I'm also very involved with PEN International, so getting writers out of Myanmar and Afghanistan and Belarus, and so this protection of writers, and writers in prison for who have written politically in the wrong part of the world. So I'm involved with that, and freedom of expression. And as a lawyer, I help out that organization that's based in London, with some legal stuff, and some of the more technical aspects. So that sort of exercises my legal mind a little bit. And I'm basically feeling freer to write what I write. And I'm writing a fourth novel. No, I'm not. I'm writing a fifth novel. And it's amazing to me that I could even imagine in my life that I would be thinking about writing a fifth novel. I mean, I guess I'm in my early 60s and time has passed, but to imagine that I would have a little group of books behind me is astonishing. So I'm writing a very Australian novel, having just finished a very LA novel. So a very contemporary LA novel, which is now, I'm looking for a new agent because I feel like my existing agent wasn't really suited to this work. So I'm in the throes of that and just working on something new and having fun with it. And I meet with my writing group every week on Zoom, and we read our stuff to each other. Janet Fitch, who's an American writer who wrote White Oleander, which was a big book here and sold. So it was an Oprah book and sold in 20 something languages.
And a
Dylan
film, I
Landis,
believe.
and a film, and Dylan Landis, who's a wonderful writer out of New York, short story writer mostly. And anyway, we read our stuff to each other and then we respond in the moment. And so that's a weekly practice that sort of keeps me nudging me forward. Like I need some pages for the group, and then I have some responses from the group to keep me going. And just to follow up on what you said earlier, thinking of Henry Miller, I don't write big, woolly, wonderful books. I write quite spare, and a lot of work is editing, although my original effort on the page would come from that process. I do a lot of turning before I go forward. So I make sure what's behind me, whether or not I jettison it in the end, I have to feel like it's in good shape before I move forward, because it will tell me where I'm supposed to go. And if I write a shitty first draft, as they say, I feel like I can just trail off into something ordinary, when if it's honed enough, it can be, excuse me, it can be, it can fashion a form that'll take me forward.
So at this point in your career, where you're on your fifth book and you're able to look back a bit, is there anything you would tell your younger, just starting out self at any age, whether you were just starting out with that first novel or before that, and I'm asking this question, but asking you what you would tell a younger writer who's grappling with this stuff, how would you guide them? Because to return to how I opened this conversation, it's a difficult craft. It's difficult in and of itself. It's difficult to do it well. It's difficult to live by doing it. And it's difficult to live with it, I think, in a way. It's difficult to live with the process of being a writer and of writing and how it affects yourself, how it affects people around you. So within that framework, is there something that you would tell that younger you?
I mean, I feel quite emotional when I hear that question, because it's such a struggle. And there's part of me that would want to recommend, don't quit your day job, which is what my first editor in London said, because I thought, here I am, it's going to change my life. And in a way it did. But then there's another part of me that wants to say, quit your day job and pursue this passion. But it's so scary and lonely. So I think what I would recommend, and I did this, and so this isn't really talking to my younger self, but I would recommend finding people in the world who can support this creative part of you. Other writers, like I would go to readings, and then I would make friends with writers and become part of a world. I joined PEN, which is a group of writers, and I went to PEN events, so that I had a support network of people who were experiencing the world in the same way. Because there's nothing more soul destroying than reading my first chapter to my family and just seeing them look at me back in Australia on the farm, look at me kind of stony faced and vaguely horrified. And that, so it's about having support. And I think being with a group, if you can, that you trust, that is nurturing and that's direct enough and real. I mean, in my group now, we're very direct and we cut straight to the chase. But I think to be around people who are creative and nurturing and and artists, and finding a world that can contain the anxieties and the loneliness and the struggle of choosing that path. But I feel like if writing is if you're a writer, it's kind of what you have to do. If you're called to do it, that's what you do. And however you orchestrate it with survival, whether you marry someone who's well-heeled, or you apply for these fellowships. And I was lucky that I got some of those, and I felt a bit guilty about getting them because I wasn't a writer in as much financial need, but I was a writer who needed a space and a place and a world where I could explore what I was doing on the page. So I think there are many ways to skin the cat. I would say just to my younger self as a writer, be kind and be patient. Someone said to me when I published in the UK and elsewhere, she said, it'll probably take about 5 years for you to be published here. And I was like, screw that. I'll get published before then. And it took 5 years. It took 5 years for me to have a publisher in Australia. And then also not to have expectations. Expectations are the seeds of disappointment and resentment. So just for me to be where I am on that page, in that scene, and fully realize that without getting into the mishigas of what's next, who's going to read this, how's it going to get published, what do I have to do? But then also being out in the world where you're meeting people and cross-pollinating and becoming known and doing what you're doing. I mean, doing a blog, participating in the literary world one way or another is also, I think, helpful. And not everyone has the ability to do that.
There's Seth Godin, who is a marketing guru who became a philosopher in my mind, who I quote quite often. He said, if you start to organize people in your field, in your area, then the powers that be will take notice. And it can be simple. It can be a writing group, like what you've done with the poetry, where there's a cluster, that's where it draws energy. It's like a heavenly body. The bigger, the more gravity it has. And another thing that I've spoken about here before is this idea called scenius, which is the genius of having a scene, a group of people together, which is something I think Brian Eno coined, where we see with Andy Warhol. Warhol wasn't Warhol. Warhol was the factory. Warhol was the scene. He was the culture around him. And I think that's very important. I think that's something that is connected also to place, and I know that in my case, I here in Israel have not connected with it for whatever reason. And I think it's a big blind spot for me, and I can feel it. It's not that it's a blind spot career-wise, professionally, which probably it is, but emotionally is the bigger point. You miss the gratification of doing what you're doing if you're not sharing it with other people who are doing it. I think that's an excellent point for people to keep in mind. So, before we wrap up, I want to ask a little more about PEN. It's a very important organization. There are not that many organizations that are standing up for the rights and the freedoms of writers around the world. It's certainly the sort of doing it in the par excellence fashion, doing the best way that anyone does that. How can people support PEN? How can we support writers who are being detained, who are being muzzled, who are being abused and oppressed? Because it's hard for most of us to imagine. People listening to this, it's almost impossible to imagine. But that is it's a very regular occurrence in many places around the world. It's sort of the default. If you speak out of turn, as writers are known to do, you face reprisals and consequences. So how can we support PEN? How do we get involved? How do we learn? How do we get involved with that mission?
Yeah, we forget what a luxury it is to be able to sit in our spaces and write what we like, when we want to, how we want to, and disseminate it how we want to. And so it's so easy to forget that there are writers in parts of the world that are being persecuted for what they write. Journalists, you think about the number of journalists in Mexico who have been assassinated. And now, these writers, women writers in Afghanistan, under that new regime. And, we have on the board of PEN International, a writer from Myanmar who was in prison for 5 years. Our new PEN International president is a guy called Burhan Somnez, who is published in 27 languages or something, and is Kurdish, but lives in Turkey. He's now at Cambridge, but he was tortured by the Turks for part of his work as a Kurdish writer. So that there are these risks that are involved in writers, and as writers of some privilege, I think it behooves us to be aware of them and then support them and support freedom of expression generally. So it's totally easy to sign up onto the PEN International website or the PEN America website. PEN International oversees 150 PEN centers all around the world, in indigenous languages and in troubled parts of the world and in other parts of the world. So go to the website, see how you can donate. You can become a writer. You can join the writer's circle for a certain amount of donations, a certain level of donation. There are all sorts of opportunities to be supportive in your local PEN center, wherever you are in the world, and through PEN International, which is the main center of the organization out of London. So,
Amazing.
yes, please do it.
I personally will do it, PEN Israel. I encourage everybody else to do the same. And even if you don't have the ability to donate right now, just go check out the website and get on Twitter and find those writers. I just wrote a piece about Nicaragua, where journalists are being thrown into prison left, right, and center by the Sandinistas, who had freed that country from the former dictatorship and now just have become a copy-paste version of the thing that they despised. it's all around us. So it's something we absolutely need to pay attention to. It feels like it's a bygone thing, it's something, a relic from a bygone era. It's absolutely not. This stuff happens every single day. So thank you for that. So where can we find you online or anywhere else in the real world, if that's where we should find you?
I feel like I've a little bit retreated from the real world. I do have a website, davidfranciswriter.com. I'm on Instagram at David Francis Writer, but I've retreated from that somewhat. I'll probably get heated up again as I have a new book out and get more immersed in that world. But feel free to contact me through my website if you would choose, if you so choose. And I'm happy to make contact and happy to discuss any of this or with writers and work with writers in ways of getting into that vivid continuous dream, as I call it, or to edit and chat and be part of the global community of writers.
That's an amazing offer. So thank you, David. I'm sure some of the listeners will take you up. And last question, which of your books do you think is the best entry point into your work? Which is the most, what you would recommend as someone who's just starting out reading you?
I would say Wedding Bush Road, which was my last book, might be the most accessible. The Great Inland Sea, the first book, is a little more challenging in some ways. Not that that's a bad thing. And then the Stray Dog Winter is a sort of literary suspense novel. So it depends what you're drawn to. I would just check them out and see what resonates.
Amazing. Thank you very much, David. It's been a great conversation. I've taken away a lot from it, and I hope to stay in touch.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Ashley. Thanks so much.